it say about the Labour Party that we end up with the two front runners being brothers? I mean, it's a very bizarre situation, particularly to people perhaps who are outsiders.
Says we come from an unusual family, I suppose. I don't know. I think there are 5 good candidates at this leadership election. I think it was right that anyone who wanted to stand put their names forward. And in the end, it's for the Labour Party and other people who vote in this election to decide who wins.
What are the most important elements of your platform?
I think the most important thing that I'm saying is that we need to put values at the centre of what we say and what we do, because I think people lost a sense over time when we were in government of who we were and what we were for. It doesn't happen because of one decision you make, it happens over time. I think it happened particularly in the second term, third term that we were in power. And I want to be very clear in this leadership election. I do believe that our society is too unequal. We need to do something about it. I do think we got the balance wrong between the state and individual liberty. I think we need to redress that as a political party. I do think that climate change and the environment need to be central to our political vision. And I think it's by standing up for values that people get more of a sense of who you are and where you stand. I think that's very, very important for the Labour Party going forward. The other thing I would say is that I think I'm the candidate who's most identified the need for change. Because when you lose an election, you can't just say, well, actually, we were right and the audience or the electorate were wrong. You've got to accept where you went wrong and accept the mistakes that you made.
Now, on equality, what did Labour get wrong? Why is it that they only just about managed to hold the ring and stay steady and never managed to improve on the damage that the Thatcherite era had done?
I think it's partly because you're running up a down escalator, if you like, in a global economy, but also we were very worried about talking about the top of society and the responsibilities at the top of society, and we should have talked about that earlier. I've said the top rate of tax shouldn't just be a deficit reduction measure, but it should stay in place permanently. I've said that we also need a high pay commission to look at all of the issues of tax, of corporate governance, of transparency. But I think part of this is not just about policy, but about changing the culture. And I think that part of the job of politics is not just to change the law, but also, or the tax system, but also to change the norms of politics. And that's why I think talking about inequality at the bottom and at the top, if you like, is very important to us going forward.
Social democracy is mostly about spending money, and there is no money to spend at the moment. How can you present a social democratic case at a time of such austerity?
Because I think the social democratic case is not just about spending money. We don't measure it simply on the basis of how much money is spent. We measure it on the basis of outcomes. I think we showed in the manifesto some of the ways in which we could improve our society without necessarily involving lots more spending, about how we could increase the minimum wage, about how we could improve schools, about how we could change some of the rules in relation to financial services, high and exorbitant interest rates, for example. So I think there are definitely ways that you can change your society without necessarily spending money. I do say, however, we have to win a big argument. The coalition want to persuade people that the only thing that matters in our society is the deficit. That over the next 4 or 5 years, to the exclusion of all the other issues, whatever the consequences, the only thing that matters is to reduce that deficit. That's not, I don't agree with that. If we'd taken that attitude after 1945, we wouldn't have built a national health service. And I do think this is an important point about opposition. You need opposition, not opportunism. So when the government does the right thing on civil liberties, for example, I will say I agree with them. I won't just oppose them for the sake of it. Similarly, in relation to crime, but on the deficit, as I've said, I will be very tough on them because I think they're doing the wrong thing.
Who are you going to make your shadow chancellor?
I'm not measuring the curtains. I think it's very important in this leadership election to await people's verdict, to campaign very hard on the platform that you're standing on, which is what I'm doing, to say how we need to change, because we fundamentally need to change in all kinds of ways. Our electoral strategy, I think, needs to change. Our policy needs to change. Our attitude to the Labour Party needs to change. And the way we see a political party and the combination of a politics of power and a politics of movement. But I don't think you start going around handing out jobs before you've got the job yourself.
How else would you reclaim liberalism for Labour?
I think partly the way we need to reclaim it is we need to be honest about the mistakes that we made. 90 days, ID cards. I think the problem for us is that liberty was in our foundation, if you like, because the right to join and form a trade union is a very, very basic liberty in a civilized society. But I think that strain of an attachment to liberty needs to be more of a part of our identity in the 21st century. I think there is an electorate out there that cares a lot about these issues, that thought we were casual about extending the power of the state. And I think that is always a danger for Labour. And I think it's partly by being honest about where we went wrong, really being open where I think the coalition is doing the right thing, that I think we start to reclaim some of that ground.
If we do get the referendum on AV, will you be out there campaigning hard for it?
I will be out there campaigning for it. And I think it's an important change. I think it's got to be part of a much bigger set of changes around the House of Lords. I favour votes at 16, more powerful local government. I do say this, though, that for supporters of electoral reform, what the coalition is doing is deeply wrong, because they are spatchcocking together a referendum on the alternative vote with a complete gerrymandering of the boundaries and the abolition of public inquiries into boundaries which have existed, I think, for more than 60 years. And so this looks a lot like opportunism, not a genuine commitment to electoral reform. And I think we are therefore right to oppose the bill. We are not happy at all with this bill, which is why we're going to oppose it. And I think the coalition should think again about putting together the right thing, which is having a referendum on AV, and the wrong thing, which is this attempt at electoral gerrymandering.
Assuming that we get the referendum and then the referendum is won, doesn't that mean that in the long run it's likely to be a coalition government, is likely to be the future, one way or another? That means Labour's going to have to work with the Lib Dems. Well, after a lot of the things that have been said, and a lot of the rage and the fury and the determination to attack the Lib Dems more than the Conservatives, can you see that as being practicable?
Well, again, I think it's a different form of a measuring the curtains question. I think we're a long way away from sort of coalitions or the next election. What I would say is that I think there is an honourable tradition in the Liberal Democrats, which is a genuine commitment to social justice. I think there is a completely different tradition now represented by people like Nick Clegg. And I was very shocked, to be honest, in the coalition negotiations, because these are people who don't just care about sort of small state or limiting the power of the state when it comes to individual liberty. They also are pretty right-wing when it comes to economics. It's no surprise to me that Nick Clegg and David Cameron are getting on well. I think they come from very similar political hue. I certainly think that tradition of the Liberal Democrats, represented by Nick Clegg, would be very difficult for any future Labour government, Labour leader to work with.
Now, in the course of your campaign for the leadership, there's been a lot of skirmishing around who stood for what over the Iraq war. You were out of the country at the time. You didn't have a vote anyway. You were certainly not a member of Parliament. But there's been some doubt cast on whether you were really against the war, as you didn't speak up against it.
I was very clear, and I talked to people about this, which is that I thought it was right to have given the weapons inspectors more time and wrong to go to war at the time that we did. I think that the real lesson of Iraq is that there was a train being driven by the United States. We didn't get off the train, and we should have done. I think it's also the case that we should have some very clear principles about when and where we intervene in terms of foreign policy, because war needs to be a last resort. You need to have a broad-based alliance, as we did in relation to Kosovo and Sierra Leone, for example, and Afghanistan, and you need to uphold the principles of the UN. And I don't think those principles were followed in relation to Iraq, and I think we need to learn those lessons. And also, I think for a large part of the electorate, or some part of the electorate, we need to move on as well and show that we understand it was a mistake.
Would you say this was one of the big differences between you and your brother?
I think it's one of the issues where we disagree. But look, there's a range of things in this leadership election where the different candidates have different views. I think the thing that I'm saying most of all is that if we stay in a New Labour comfort zone, if we say that actually we were right and we can recreate the formula of 1994 and that will win us victory, I think we're wrong. I think on flexible labour markets, we need to move on, because the truth is that saying you want maximum flexibility in the labour market means you leave millions of people on low wages. I think on tuition fees, we got it wrong. We need to move on. We need to accept it was a barrier to aspiration in this country. I think we need to rethink the whole idea of aspiration, which sometimes under New Labour became quite narrow. Of course, it is about earning and owning, as I think was once said, but it is about a much wider set of things, about the kind of community you live in, about the nature of your town centre, about whether you have sufficient time with your kids. And I've said we need to move on in relation to our attitude to the balance between the state and the individual. So I think it's a different electorate now. And I think it's got to be a different formula, a different approach for the future.
You've said we should be critical friends of Israel. What does that mean in terms of changing our present policies?
I think that the Gaza blockade, what happened with Gaza in terms of the flotilla was appalling. I think we should say it. I think the Gaza blockade is wrong. I've said that in relation to the EU, there is a question about upgrading the trading relationship. I think that we should use our EU muscle to get the Gaza blockade lifted, so we should work within the EU. We should work with the United States as well. I think it's partly about being willing to be open and clear about your attitude to countries, whether they are considered historic friends or not.
People accuse you of taking Labour back to its comfort zone, of saying everything to Labour people that Labour people want to hear, whether it's the trade unions, whether it's party members. You're the person who is not for difficult decisions, but for the primrose path, if you like.
Look, I'm saying what I believe. I'm saying what I believe. I think it's total nonsense to say that I want to take Labour back to the early 1980s. It's what I call the sort of tyranny of new Labour, or the tyranny of old Labour, which is basically that if someone disagrees with you, you say, they just want to take us back to our path. We've got to be very clear about this. If we stay in a new Labour comfort zone, New Labour was right for its time, but if we stay in a new Labour comfort zone, if we say the solutions of the mid-90s will be the solutions of the 2010s to 2015s, we're wrong. Take the electorate, for example. We lost a lot more lower income groups at the general election, I think 6 times more than in the highest income group. Now, that's profound lessons there about how we speak to our working class base. That's not a core vote strategy, because the core vote became the swing vote. We lost massive amounts of ground among so-called DEs, the lowest income group in the population, and among C2s as well, skilled manual workers. But let's be clear about this. The primary loss for Labour did not take place among the AB voters, the highest income voters, and actually they didn't go to the Conservatives, they went to the Liberal Democrats, if you look at 1997 to 2010. And I think there's also a lesson about the Labour Party, because if we take the attitude that the Labour Party is basically some mad left-wing body with members who kind of have views that are kind of off the charts, I think we are absolutely fooling ourselves and doing a massive disservice to our party. Actually, our party was right on a lot of issues, on housing, on agency workers, on tuition fees, and you need a different style of leadership. And I offer a different style of leadership. I'm not embarrassed to say that I listening to the public and listening to our party. And, if we really genuinely believe in the power of movement, if the way we think we can get the power of movement is by a group at the top simply deciding everything, we're completely fooling ourselves, because you'll never build the kind of movement you need. And one of the problems that Labour had at the election, and one of the reasons we lost in various places, was because we were hollowed out as a political party, because people had left us, frankly. And I'm not one of these people who believes, well, you can just win with the air war, if you like. You can just win by having talking heads on television. You need the people on the ground. And I think that's a very important lesson, one of the very important lessons we've got to learn.
Is that the big difference between you and your brother, that he is really the back to 1997? And after all, that's not bad. Labour won 3 elections for the first time in its history. That's not a bad offer.
I'm not going to change what I've said throughout this leadership lesson. I'm not going to start to get into compare and contrast. I speak for myself. Other people make the judgments. What I would say is we've got to combine the coalition that New Labour built, lower and middle income people, being a party that's for wealth creation as well as distribution, getting value for money in public spending, but we've also got to recognise the way the world has changed. And just going back to the solutions of the mid-1990s is not going to work. And what I also say is that caricaturing people as saying, that's just a return to old Labour, frankly, our party should be better than that, and the debate needs to be better than that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.